Good evening and welcome everyone. Today I'm speaking to Marcel Crok. He's from the Netherlands and he is part of the organization Clintel that has written a lot of interesting articles about the environmental movement, about climate change in general. And we're going to get into a few of the campaigns that they're doing at the moment. So Marcel, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you give us a background about Clintel? How do you pronounce it, first of all?
Clintel. In Dutch, we say Clintel. It stands for climate intelligence. So, dealing with climate change in an intelligent way. That's where the name is coming from. And it was founded by myself and a professor, Guus Berghout of the Technical University in Delft in 2019. And I have been working as a science journalist after I finished my study in chemistry, physical chemistry, and then after that I became a science writer, and I've been dealing with climate change since around 2005 with a long article about. You just told me that you had McIntyre in the show. And it was actually McIntyre and McKittrick who became the reason that I became interested in climate change. So I was the first journalist who wrote a very long article about their work.
Okay, that's interesting. So just for clarity, I only spoke to McIntyre. I didn't have him on the show yet, but I'm planning a channel with them in the future.
Okay. Sorry.
No, it's not an issue. It's just for the audience. They might look for the video. Can you maybe give us sort of a background? Because the previous guests have been mentioning it on the hockey stick. I mean, I'm not expecting you to go through the entire analysis, but what was wrong about the hockey stick? I mean, let's start there.
Yeah, I was working for a science magazine, popular science magazine in Holland. You can compare it with Scientific American. So it was a monthly magazine. It doesn't exist anymore nowadays. And then my editor-in-chief, he said to me, "Yeah, there's something going on with the hockey stick. Can you look into this?" And I often had to write the cover articles, so the longer articles every month. And I did my research, and then I quickly found out that there were two Canadians, McIntyre and McKittrick, who had huge criticism on the hockey stick, but their article about it was rejected by Nature magazine. And the original hockey stick by Michael Mann was originally published in Nature in 1998. And it was very prominent in the IPCC report in 2001. And so, I went back to my editor-in-chief. I said, well, there is maybe an interesting story by two Canadians, but their paper was rejected by Nature. And we are journalists, so normally we have to rely on stuff that is peer-reviewed, you know. And so, but at the time, my best friend was working in Hamburg in Germany for a PhD. And there was a German professor there, and he also had critique on the hockey stick. It was Hans von Storch. And so I said to my editor, I will go to this professor in Germany, and this is my last chance. And von Storch told me the Nature paper by McIntyre and McKittrick should have been published, in my opinion, he said. And then I said, whoa, if this professor takes it so serious, then I also should take it serious.
Right.
So then I started to approach McIntyre and McKittrick. I had a long phone call with McIntyre, Toronto, Amsterdam. We talked for 3 hours, and his whole story, he was working on it for 2 years already at the time. And so his whole story came out. And then I said, whoa, this is really interesting. I want to write about it, but I need a peer-reviewed publication. And then I was lucky. They were going to publish their work in Geophysical Research Letters, and they gave me the scoop because I was more or less the first journalist who was really interested in their story, and I wanted to bring a long article about it. So in February 2005, we published a very long article in our Dutch magazine. I think it was 12 pages. It was very long. It was 5,000 or 6,000 words. And because we realized it was so international, we also translated the article into English, and McKittrick arranged that the National Post in Canada also published the full article in English. Also, they published it in 2 days, because in 1 day it was too long for 1 day. So in 2 days they published it, and this was interesting because it meant that people like Michael Mann, the hockey stick, the inventor of the hockey stick, you could say, he could also read my article. And later on, when we had ClimateGate, are you familiar with ClimateGate?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the hacked emails, my article was in the ClimateGate emails. Yeah. So
Okay,
they talk
that's
about they talk about that Dutch magazine. They don't mention my name, but they
There's
talk
only
about
one Dutch magazine. Yeah.
that Dutch magazine. And the reason was that what happened after my article came out, I won a prize. To my surprise, I won a prize with this article in Holland. At the time, it was also already very controversial issue, but many people in Holland realized that this was quite special research that I had been doing. I had been working on this for 2 months, and so I won a prize, 10,000 euros. It was quite a reasonable prize, but at the same time, our National Climate Institute, which is called KNMI, started attacking me. They said, "Whoa, this is all bullshit. What Marcel is writing, it's false." And what was interesting, they said we were misquoted, because when I had finished my article, I wanted to have a reaction from KNMI. In Holland, this is normal. If you, as a journalist, you ask for the reaction of KNMI, like in France for the National Weather Association, or in England, from Headcrut, from the Met Office, you ask from the official institute, you ask for a reaction. And the guy from KNMI had said in my article, "Well, this is a serious issue." I thought, yeah, you bet, this is really a serious issue. And we are going to discuss this in Beijing in the next IPCC meeting. And then when my article came out, he said, "Well, I was misquoted, and I didn't understand it, because the quote was so, it was not very special. This is a serious issue. We are going to discuss this in Beijing. What's so special about the quote?" And he had said it on the phone, and I had my written notes on the phone call. But then, only 4 years later, when ClimateGate emails came, and I saw the email from Michael Mann to Phil Jones about that Dutch article, guess what the email said? Michael Mann said to Phil Jones, "IPCC is not going to discuss this in Beijing."
Okay. Just for clarity, Phil Jones was one of Michael Mann's co-hockey stick plotters.
Yeah, and he was the central figure in the ClimateGate emails. The BBC last year even made a program, a special film documentary. No, a film. They made a film about ClimateGate with Phil Jones having the central role.
And they portray it as if the attack on the hockey stick was a propaganda exercise.
Of course, by the fossil fuel funded climate change deniers, etc., etc. Well, now I have met McIntyre several times. I've been visiting his house in Toronto. I've met McKittrick several times. They are very fine scientists, they're very decent people. They are very to the content of the matter, and they're not interested in all those other things. So
it's ridiculous, and they don't speak, because when I started reading up on the hockey stick as well, I was interested really in the technical stuff. Okay, the data, if you will. As an engineer, so I'm data minded, and in my mind, and I may be wrong on this, and like to get your view on this, I don't think anyone has ever spoken to the technical critique against the hockey stick. One is height of decline, truncating the Briffa graph, and the other one, which I find is more significant, is the fact that the algorithm they used when they put red noise through it would give a hockey stick as well. That's my understanding of it. So you ask yourself, what are they proving with this methodology, basically?
Yeah, so they never really reacted on the McIntyre-McKittrick paper, but they said something like, "Well, we can use other proxies and other statistics and still get a hockey stick. That's their criticism. And maybe you have read the book The Hockey Stick Illusion by Andrew Montfort. He would
Yes, I
also
have,
be he would also be an excellent guy to speak to. And there you can see all the things that, 300 pages, 400 pages about this single affair, you could say.
And his critique is it's quite significant, because after I read that book, I asked myself, is there any proxy I can trust? And there's very few. I mean, there's some you can, obviously, but I'm highly skeptical of the certainty that is given to past climate reconstructions at this stage.
And that's also what McIntyre is saying after all these years, that most of the proxies probably are not very good. And what you should not do is, what they try to do is use hundreds of proxies and then use statistics and then say we can calculate a global average temperature with the proxies. And McIntyre saying, no way, this is not going to work.
Right.
Because the uncertainties back in time, the uncertainties are simply too big. So if you would really be honest about the uncertainties, it would be minus infinity to plus infinity. It's all over the place.
So when they say to us that it's never been warmer than 10,000 or 100,000 years, there's a number they pull out before humans were on Earth, I think. Can they really make that statement with confidence?
Well, that's what they try, because last year we had the 6th IPCC report, and they came up with a new hockey stick, by this Pages to K group. I'm going to close some of my email things because it might give some noise. So last year they came up with a new hockey stick, and it's old wine in new bottles. It's the same tricks over and over again. So what they do is they have this huge pool of proxies, and of course, what you can see if you or let's say differently, if you go to Climate Audit, the blog by McIntyre, you can see that he is plotting a lot of the individual proxies.
Yeah.
And what you see then is that most of the proxies, they show nothing. They show nothing. It's almost noise,
Some are upside down, which is weird,
Yes, some are upside down, and they are flipped. They are flipped by the IPCC authors, and so they go down in the 20th century, but they use them upward, as if they show warming. It's really crazy. And so, long story short, this hockey stick article that I was working on for 2 months, it was my first article ever on climate. So I was really open-minded. I was neutral when I began. For me, it was very intriguing, and especially the reaction by KNMI and the reaction by all the climate scientists in the Netherlands was very defensive. They were not open-minded. They were attacking me, and they were not saying, "Okay, Marcel, this is great work. This is investigative reporting. You did a great job, and we have to look into this because we probably made an error in IPCC. We accepted it blindly from the peer-reviewed status of the papers, but we shouldn't have done that. We should have been more careful." And they didn't do that, and they never did it. IPCC never acknowledged that this was a huge error. Never.
Didn't they at one stage remove the hockey stick from an old report as well? That was also alleged at one stage from a former assessment or something. No, okay.
No, they didn't. No, they didn't do. And after the critique by McIntyre and Kittrick, they came with all these spaghetti graphs. So they didn't have one very steep hockey stick, you could say, but they had these spaghetti graphs where you have all these reconstructions, and it becomes less. It looks less spectacular, And what many people don't realize is that the hockey stick, they think, what is the hockey stick? So it starts in the year 1000, here, and then it goes rather flat, and then in 1900 it goes steeply up. And people think that the part going steeply up is the special part, but that's not the special part. What is special is the climate being so stable for all these centuries, because from the literature, we know we had a warm medieval period when the Vikings went to Greenland, and we had a little ice age. when we had these strong cold winters, and we had all these famous Dutch painters showing all these ice people on the ice skating and all these, and so what the IPCC is saying, that was nothing, because if you average it on the globe, you don't see it at all. It was meaningless. It was flat. The
But
climate was stable.
I've been asking this question to some guests, and I'd like to get your view on that. What does it mean if they say the average temperature of the Earth? I mean, do you have a thermometer in the North Pole somewhere to measure does it even have a sense?
Well, yeah, nowadays you could say it has a little bit of sense, although they use anomaly, of course, instead of just the real average temperature. But yeah, like I said, if you go back, you're depending on the proxies, on the tree rings, on the corals, on other proxies. The uncertainties are huge. And so what McIntyre is saying is that you better use local proxies. For example, if you look at tree line, if you go up in the mountains, at a certain point, you have the tree line. Above that point, you don't find any trees anymore.
Right.
But nowadays, if you go into the Alps or you go to Scandinavia, you find remains of trees above the current tree line. And then trees, that's a big advantage of trees. You can date them very precisely by the carbon.
So it's not the tree rings, it's the line of the vegetation, basically.
Yeah, so then you don't, well, you use the tree rings for the dating, yeah, because you can find out this tree was living 2000 before Christ, So 2000 before Christ, there was a tree 200 meters higher, was living there than the current tree line. So, it probably was a lot warmer. They say, I think a rule of thumb is that every 100 meter, if the tree line goes up 100 meter, it's about 0.6 degrees warmer. Okay. So if you find remains of trees a lot higher than the current tree line, that's a good indication that at the time it was pretty warm.
And if you use these proxies that are consistent, if we can say that, not all, because we know all of them aren't, and those who have gone through proper methodology and they can quantify the confidence interval, so rigor basically, what do we find then with the past temperatures?
What do you mean exactly?
Well, what is the temperature? I mean, you say the stable temperature is obviously not true. So what do you find then in the past? Because I know people have been skeptical against the medieval warm period and the
that's the $60 million question. Everybody would like to know, but I don't think, and I repeat simply what McIntyre is saying, that it's possible to come up with a reasonable global average or northern hemisphere average temperature. Right. So you have to rely on local signals. What happened to McIntyre is showing a glacier on the side of Greenland. And this is an interesting glacier because on the top of Greenland, it's 3 kilometers high. And when the Greenland glacier is melting, it's also becoming less high. So you have the problem that if you drill a core on the top of Greenland, you also have to correct more or less for the difference in height,
right,
in the time. And so this is a disadvantage of those ice cores. But if you go to glaciers on the side, you have less change in height. And this glacier show a very interesting picture. We came out of the ice age 20,000 and 12,000 years ago. We quickly came out of the ice age. Then it warms up steeply until 8,000 years ago. And if we look at Milankovitch, so the Milankovitch cycles, and the solar insolation, the insolation of the sun, especially at 60 North, because they believe that the insolation there is very important for the start and end of new ice ages. So at 60 North, about 8,000 years ago, the insolation peaked. And after that, it already went down. The insolation went down at 60 North. And this glacier in Greenland shows exactly that. So from 12,000 years until 8,000 years, steep warming. And then it peaked 8,000 years ago. And from then on, we go slowly already down, 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 down until today.
So we're actually in a cooling period.
Yeah, they call this the neo-glaciation. So we are on the way to the new ice age. And this goes slowly. Yeah? So we go out of the ice age very quickly. And then we go into the next ice age very slowly.
Okay, so it's a rapid shoot out and then a slow decline. Okay.
And yeah, and also a very important question is that, okay, you see it's going down, but it's not going down in a flat line, of course. It's going down with all kinds of wiggles up and down, up and down. And so a very important question is, okay, this little ice age, maybe that was just simply part of the cooling due to Milankovitch. But then since 8050, it went up. And was it because of us, because of our CO2, or is it part of a natural cycle? And will it continue to go down again after in the next 50 to 100 years? That's a very interesting question that nobody really can answer.
Yeah, and so I want to now add the other factor to this, and I suppose this comes down to the sort of the purpose of Clintel. What is your view then of the role of carbon dioxide in all of this, given what you know about the hockey stick and the uncertainties that are involved there?
Yeah, so yeah, that's of course another $60 million question, because if CO2 has a very small effect, then of course all climate policy becomes meaningless. And
Right.
I think the current Clintel, we drafted and we published a World Climate Declaration. People can go to clintel.org, our website, and there you find our World Climate Declaration. It's only a one-page summary. You know, it's very accessible. Everybody can read it. And we have now almost 1,500 signees. If you feel comfortable and you have some knowledge about climate or climate policy, you can apply to become a signatory of the World Climate Declaration. And we have now almost 1,500.
Okay.
And so what we say in this World Climate Declaration is, the headline, the summary is, there is no climate emergency. And I think that in the Clintel community, there are a lot of people with different views. So indeed, you have a group that has the view that the current climate change is largely natural. So CO2 has a almost negligible effect, and that this is like a recovery from the little ice age, you know, and maybe a little bit of warming due to CO2, but very less.
Okay, so you don't dispute the claim, or at least some people don't dispute the claim that CO2 must have some warming, however low that might be.
No, I think most, if not all, of our signatories, of course, we never asked them all 1,500 exactly. It would be interesting, by the way, to do a survey.
I asked that question because that 97% claim that go around, that's the question they asked, which I think I've met only a few skeptics who thinks there is no greenhouse effect. I know they exist, but they're really a minority among skeptics. Most people agree that CO2, you know, it's radiated, it increases the forcing. I think it's 304 watts per square meter, something like that. Doubling will give you 1 degree, and then there's uncertainty how much extra.
I remember that you have spoken to Richard Linson, who is our US ambassador. So Clintel has in the bigger countries, we have Clintel ambassadors, and Richard Linson is our ambassador in the United States. And also Will Hepper is part of our Clintel community, and he's also a signatory. And of course, we discuss a lot of these things with people like them, you know, and people like Linson and Hepper, they agree that the pure radiation effect of a doubling of CO2 is about 1 degree Celsius. And then the rest of the debate is the feedbacks. So the IPCC and their climate models, they believe, I use the word believe because whatever you think about climate sensitivity, in a sense, it is a matter of belief, because there is no hard way to prove either if it's 1 degree or 3 degrees. it remains a little bit a matter of belief. But the IPCC believes in positive feedbacks due to water vapor and due to clouds. So a change in water vapor and a change in clouds will increase the 1 degree Celsius warming due to the radiation effect. It will increase it to 3 degrees or even 4 degrees, and that's what the climate models also show. And I have written, after the 5th IPCC report, I have written a very, in my opinion, it's one of the most interesting things I've done, a report with Nick Lewis. Nick Lewis is a British independent scientist who publishes a lot about climate sensitivity. And he estimates climate sensitivity based on the observations. So he's saying, okay, the temperature went up since 8050. The forcing went up since 8050. Yeah. So he more or less accepts the theory by IPCC. Yeah. And climate sensitivity is in a sense, it's the temperature increase divided by the forcing. You know? That's the climate sensitivity. So because we have now a period 8050 until now, it's 170 years. So we have a reasonable estimate of the temperature and of the forcing. And so you can divide those, and then you have a good estimate of what the real climate is showing in terms of climate sensitivity.
Right.
And we wrote a report about that. It's called A Sensitive Matter, because after the 5th IPCC report, it became clear that the observational estimates for climate sensitivity are on the low side of the IPCC estimates. The IPCC most often say it is somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5. And they give a best estimate of 3 degrees. And Nick Lewis, together with Judith Curry, they published a paper in 2018 after our report. And they say, well, our best estimate based on the observations is 1.6. And 1.6...
That's almost close to doubling of CO2, isn't it?
So doubling of CO2 will give 1.6 degrees of warming. It's the equilibrium climate sensitivity, the ECS. And this is at the lower range of the likely range of the IPCC. Okay. And so we said, okay, this is a sensitive matter. And we also said how the IPCC hid the good news, because the IPCC had the papers available. Nick Lewis had published about this before the 5th IPCC report. But they didn't want to shout it from the roofs, because if they would do that, then everybody would say, okay, so your models are useless, because the real climate sensitivity is maybe 1.6, and your models say it's 3 degrees or 4 degrees.
8 degrees, I've heard some people going on. It's ridiculous,
the new models for the AR6, they go to 5 degrees, 6 degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2, which is, in my opinion, that's really ridiculous. So back to your question, I think in the Clintel community, there is a really large range of views. Most people accept that CO2 will cause some warming. A lot of people think that other natural factors should not be discarded. So maybe the sun is doing more. People like Willie Soon, they are also in the Clintel network. They are also signees of the World Climate Declaration. So maybe the sun is doing more, or internal variability, natural variability of the climate system may be larger. The Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation playing a larger role, or ENSO, La Nina, all those kind of stuff.
Right.
But I think nowadays, because this debate, at the moment, you can never win, because they will say, the other side, they have won. The IPCC has won, the United Nations, they have won. They say the science is settled, there is a 97% consensus, etc., etc. So nowadays, I prefer not to play this game anymore and say, okay. Let's say that all the warming since 8050 is due to your greenhouse gases. Okay, I give you your whole view. Yeah. And then I say, but what is the problem? Where is the emergency? Where is the crisis?
But does the IPCC even say there's a crisis? Because my understanding of the IPCC, and correct me if I'm wrong, is they've got three parts of the report. The first one is the science part, and then it becomes, I think, impact, and then the third one is like a statement for policy makers. And
Yeah.
as you go from the first to the third one, you get everything redacted in a few punchlines. So when I read the scientific part, I mean, I can't read all 1,500 pages, and nobody reads it, I think.
Mhm.
I find it very difficult to see the emergency even in their own texts. You know.
But you know that the summary for policymakers and how the summary for policymakers is. Did you ever watch a press conference if they launch the report and the working group one report and they have a press conference and then they say things. Oh, the climate is getting more and more extreme. But
Right.
then comes a guy like Roger Pielke Jr., who knows everything about extremes and the damage because of extremes, and he say, "This is not true because look into the report. Hurricanes are not increasing, floods are not increasing, drought is not increasing, hail is not increasing, tornadoes is not increasing, etc., etc., etc. The only thing they claim is increasing is extreme precipitation, but extreme precipitation maybe is increasing in some parts of the world, but it's not leading to more floods, you know? So
But is
that's
that a
not
bad thing? I mean, if you have more
yeah, well,
rain, I think some people will like it. Farmers would love
well,
it.
yeah, okay, but extreme precipitation, if it becomes really extreme, it can become dangerous, of course, or
Okay.
it can cause some harm. But it's not. It's we don't see it in flooding. There is no trend in flooding globally,
Right.
and the other trend there might be, according to IPCC, is an increasing trend in heat waves. And this is currently not unexpected, although you see a lot of regional differences. Because look at the US. We have good data in the US that the 30s with the Dust Bowl, the 30s dominate all the record books still, you know. So the 30s in the US were hotter than it currently is in the US. But in Europe, it's true. It's probably true that we now have more heat waves than in the 50s, especially in the 50s, because the 50s and the 60s and the 70s in Europe were quite cold, you know. So if you compare to that period, yeah, we have an increase. But we also see that in the 40s in the Netherlands, we also had a lot of heat waves.
Yeah.
So even that needs
But,
some
but but I mean,
nuance.
isn't that just cherry picking your starting date? I mean, I would assume that you would go. Okay, I understand not all the places have good data. I'm sure in most places in Africa we don't have data even for the last 20, 30 years. But be that as it may, I mean, if you say, okay, it's more heat wave since the 1950s, that might be completely true and yet misleading, because
Yeah, I
you have to
agree.
compare it to the 1930s as well. And if we don't see increases since then, I mean, y- you can't really conclude anything.
Yeah, yeah. And another aspect, of course, is that what Björn Lomborg points out is that cold is much more dangerous for human beings than heat. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there die a lot more people die because of cold than because of heat. So if the heat is going up a little bit, maybe you get a little bit more heat-related deaths, but you get less cold-related death. So, and that number might be much bigger. That decrease might be much bigger than the increase in heat-related death. So, my conclusion at the moment, and that's what I also do in public lectures, when I give public lectures in the Netherlands, I emphasize that even if you accept most of the IPCC reports, then you can still conclude that there is no real climate problem, let alone a climate emergency or a climate crisis. And
I
you
mean,
are right that strictly speaking, they don't mention the word climate crisis or climate emergency. That, that
yes.
that's that's the propaganda in the media or among politicians. I mean, the European Parliament in 2019, we were in the European Parliament giving a press conference about our World Climate Declaration. So we presented that for a number of members of Parliament, and so we explained to them there is no climate emergency. A week later, the European Parliament officially declared a climate emergency. But that's a political statement, of course,
But
and
but
it
I mean,
has
there's so much political capital in this issue. I mean, I was trying to think where the problem is, and I think part of the problem and is that the IPCC exists in the first place. Because if there's no emergency, you would ask the second question: why are we paying all these guys to study the emergency that's not there?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. A lot of people, in my own analysis, there has been even a book written about it. What happened? I don't know if you're familiar with what happened in the second IPCC report.
No.
So we had the first IPCC report in 1990, and the report said yes, we have some warming, about 0.6 degrees Celsius of warming, but they talk about attribution, so detection and attribution. Detection is a change detected, and then attribution is, can we find a cause for the detected trend? And they said, they were honest in the first report. They said, well, we cannot say if this is anthropogenic greenhouse warming, or if this is a natural thing. So there was no claim in the first IPCC report that the warming was caused by the greenhouse gases. Although this, of course, was the reason that they founded the IPCC. That the reason was already that they believed that it was the greenhouse gases would.
So it was a foregone conclusion. You cannot go against the church.
Again, yes, exactly. And then in 1992 we had the Rio Climate Conference. And so this was the start of the UNFCCC, which organizes the yearly COPs, the Conference of the Parties. And they already said in 1992, we have to avoid a dangerous human interference of the climate system. But by that, they meant because of greenhouse gases, because their definition of climate change was those changes that are caused by greenhouse change in the atmospheric composition. Right. So the political part of the whole climate issue had a very, very narrow definition of climate change. Only if it is caused by greenhouse gases, it was called climate change. If it was natural climate change, it wasn't even climate change. That was the definition. Then came the second IPCC report in 1995. And the second report, the draft of the second report still said, we are not sure if this is natural warming or if it's due to greenhouse gases. But they were working on the Kyoto Protocol, which ultimately came into being in 1997, 2 years later. Right. And my analysis is, and also other people, that the IPCC people were put under pressure to come up with the evidence that yes, it is the greenhouse gas, because otherwise the politicians couldn't move forward with the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah. And then what happened in Madrid? In Madrid, they had to finalize the report, the summary for policymakers. All these countries, they visit in Madrid, 200 countries, and they go through the summary for policymakers line by line. So for a week, they negotiate about every sentence in the summary for policymakers. They still do this. And then Ben Center, the American climate scientist Ben Center, he went to the chairman of the IPCC Working Group 1, John Houghton. He passed away a few years ago. And he said, well, I have new evidence that the humans are responsible for the warming. But it was his own paper, and the paper was not yet peer-reviewed. It was not yet published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Right.
And Fred Singer, the famous Fred Singer, the famous climate skeptic Fred Singer, this was the period that oil countries and oil companies were still willing to pay climate skeptics. Nowadays, they no way, they will never do that.
They're on board nowadays with the agenda.
Yes, exactly. But at the time, in the 80s and the 90s, they were still willing to pay also the other side, to have some balance in the debate. And Fred Singer, he was part of Saudi Arabia. So he was in the team of Saudi Arabia. Right. And when Ben Center came with this new evidence, and he said, I would like to present my new evidence. Then then Fred Singer said, ho, this goes against the rules of the IPCC, because your paper should have been published already in a peer-reviewed journal. It's not acceptable that you now bring this new evidence into the process. And Singer was right about this, but the chairman of the IPCC was on the hand of Ben Center, and he allowed him to give a presentation about his new evidence.
So the
And
people who argue that peer review is this gold standard obviously were prepared to corrupt the system, for political purposes back then.
yes, and then what happened is that okay, this became a huge fight in Madrid. I've also spoken with some Dutch people who were there, and they had a memory that yeah, there was a lot of fighting going on there about this. But then ultimately, in Friday night, I think Friday night, most of the country delegations already left because their planes were going and they were simply leaving. And then they decided to add a single sentence to the summary for policymakers, and that's a very famous one. There is a discernible human influence on the climate. That simple sentence had to be added to the summary for policymakers of the second IPC report. But then what happened was that the underlying report, the chapter about detection and attribution, had several sentences saying, we don't know if it's natural or if it's anthropogenic. So the summary for policymakers suddenly was not in line anymore with the underlying chapter, which
That,
normally should be the case. And then what happened when Ben Center came back to his hotel room, he started single-handedly, he started to change the underlying chapter.
wow,
And so
that's fraud, yeah.
Yeah, and so it took 1 year because it takes a long time between the summary for policymakers is accepted and then before the real report, the full report, is being published. So only 1 year later, in June 1996, the full report came out. But Fred Singer, of course, he was very aware of this, what happened in Madrid, and he started looking in the chapter, and then he saw that Center must have changed the underlying chapter because then he only found out that he had done that.
Wow.
And then Frederick Seitz, which was also a very famous climate skeptic in the US, they're all dead now. They're all passed away. Frederick Seitz published an opinion, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, explaining what had happened in Madrid and what Ben Center had done in the underlying chapter. And that was, in my opinion, that was the start of the climate war. Because
okay.
then people like mainstream climate scientists in the US, they had to decide which side I'm going to choose. Do I choose for Frederick Seitz and Fred Singer, who are skeptics paid by the oil industry, maybe, or maybe I feel that Ben Center was a little bit naughty what he did there, but I still defend him because he's my colleague. He's a mainstream climate scientist. He's an academic, etc.
So that was the point that, according to you, that the climate change went from whatever science was left in it to just politics. It just became tribal from that day.
Yeah. So there is an Australian guy. He works in a library, but he also approached Fred Singer and Ben Center about this event, and he wrote long articles. He even wrote a book about it, and his name is Bernie Lewin. It's very very intriguing work that he done, and his article about what happened in Madrid was titled "The Last Day of Climate Science." And in my opinion, that's a correct conclusion because that was the moment that they actually left honest climate science and it became fully politicized and polarized. And so you had this division between, okay, are you in the camp of Fred Singer and Frederick Seitz, or are you in the camp of the good guys, the academics, etc., the government funded people? And most academics, of course, they choose the side of Ben Center and the academics because otherwise you're in deep trouble. Look at Willie Soon. Willie Soon criticized the hockey stick already in 2003. And after that, he never got any funding from NASA or the National Science Foundation. Never, ever. Because you are not allowed to
But the way you describe this to me is just, it's a systemic issue. I mean, I want to ask you, as a journalist, have you paid a price as well, or for questioning? Because most journalists are on board with this story.
Oh yeah, I would say. I mean, I'm happy. I have a I have a roof above me. I have a house. I have since Clintel, I have a reasonable income. But for many years, I was also like excommunicated. Dutch media didn't want to work with me. Um, but yeah, I think what saved me was that I'm a reasonable guy. I'm not very aggressive.
Yeah.
So a lot of and Dutch politics is also, yeah, we call this the polder model. And the polder model means that we always have this tendency to negotiate with all the people, with all the different views. Everybody is welcome. So what happened is that several ministers, even, they invited me to come to the ministry to talk with them. But in the end, of course, and then they put this in the media. They put in the media. Yes, I've also had a nice discussion with Marcel, etc., etc. So they want to show to the media I'm open-minded. I look at all the sides of the debate. But what they do, of course, in practice is they give me no money anymore, because all the climate money is coming from the government. Let's
Yeah,
face it.
and that's the problem in every country in the world, is that the government
And
controls it. Yeah.
and an easy way to harm me is take care that I don't get any money anymore. So for many years I hardly had any income, because the media didn't want to work with me anymore. And so I had to, yeah, I could just post on my blog, or maybe give a lecture every now and then and ask somebody for giving the lecture. But companies like big companies in the Netherlands would not invite me to give a talk, because then they would be attacked, they would be criticized for giving me a floor, giving me a podium. So it's really hard to survive. And of course, other people, like, I get a lot of support behind the scenes, that people send me an email, or some people give me a donation. They say, oh, you're a great work that you're doing, and keep on going. But I will not speak out myself publicly, because I have a wife, and I have my career, and I have my job, and I have to go on with my life. I cannot risk everything.
In Europe, and maybe in America as well, that is, I mean, at least in South Africa, you can still challenge this in the open with reservation. They might look at you a bit strange, but I don't think you'll pay that higher price. But in Netherlands, it's definitely, or in France as well, you can't even speak to it.
I would say the Netherlands is better than France or
Yeah.
Germany. We are a little bit more open-minded, and also I get, especially now after the COVID period. In the COVID period, many people became suspicious about the government.
Follow the
And
science. Yeah.
yes, exactly, follow the science, and almost we didn't have mandatory vaccination, but it was close, because there was a lot of social pressure to get your
Yeah.
vaccination. And a lot of people became suspicious about that, and they became angry, and they demonstrated. And those people are very open-minded to my views on climate, because they see the parallels between the COVID issue and the climate issue. And
And of course,
before you said you wanted to talk about the farmers' protest in the Netherlands,
yeah.
and that's the same, because they see how the farmers are treated in the Netherlands because of a nitrogen crisis. But it will take me 10 minutes to explain the nitrogen crisis. Maybe we should leave that for another podcast.
Yeah, I want to quickly get to your actually another topic I got you on. I think we only have a few minutes, for 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And that is your intervention in the Friends of the Earth Shell lawsuit. Can you maybe just give a background, what happened, short background, and then why you guys are getting involved there?
Yeah, so in the Netherlands, we have a very peculiar law, and it says that an NGO or another group representing citizens, they can go to court to start a court case in the general interest. So in the public interest. So you can, as a small environmental NGO, you can say, reducing greenhouse gases is in the public interest. And I think that the Dutch government, is not doing enough. And so I start a lawsuit against the government to enforce them to speed up their climate policies. And this is what Urgenda did in 2013 already. Urgenda was a small environmental NGO, and they used this law to attack the Dutch government, and they won. They won even in the Supreme Court, in the Dutch Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, Friends of the Earth, another environmental NGO in the Netherlands, they have a Dutch name, but it's irrelevant for this. They are part of the international group Friends of the Earth. And they decided, with the win of agenda against the state, now let's attack a company, because we believe that a company should also endorse, if they endorse the Paris Agreement, they should also take measurements that make the following the Paris Agreement possible in the future, And so they decided to attack Shell. And in the beginning, everybody again said, the lawyers in Holland said, the academics said, well, this is no chance that they're going to win. But yeah, guess what? They won. So they won against Shell. And the judge said that Shell has to reduce its emissions by 45% in 2030 in Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And Scope 1 is, you could say, it's still reasonable because that's the own emissions by the Shell company. Their own plants and their own people driving the car. So I went there to the headquarters, to the international headquarters in The Hague, and I was allowed to park in their garage, and I only saw electric vehicles. All the Shell,
they're going extreme.
All the Shell people working for the headquarters of Shell in The Hague, they all drive electric. I came there with my gasoline car. I was the strange duck. I should have made a picture. I forgot to do it, but I should have made a picture.
So I just want to get the Shell, who produces oil, and I hope they're still doing it, I don't know, is not using oil for their cars. They don't believe in their own product.
Exactly. So that's the Scope 1. But Scope 3 emissions are the emissions by the consumers. So a Dutch lawyer says that if you go in South Africa, you go to the Shell station, in 2030, Shell has to take care that this gasoline has to emit 45% less CO2 in 2030. How are you going to do that?
Yeah, I was about to ask, is that even possible?
Well, that's the first question, because maybe you have to buy up all the rainforest and all the forest in the world and make biodiesel or bio gasoline or whatever, And the verdict allows this. So the verdict could be completely crazy if Shell really tries to do it, because let's say they want to do it with nuclear. Shell is not into nuclear so far, because they are into renewables, because they knew, of course, that if they invest in wind and solar, we will, for the backup, we will until the end of times, we will need gas and oil. So it's a safe bet for them. So publicly they say, yes, we endorse Paris. Yes, we build wind farms, and we are investing in solar, and we also investing in biomass. No, we don't invest in nuclear. That's not our cup of tea. And well, when you need a backup, we can also provide the backup, because we are good in oil and gas, And they make huge profits because of the high oil price and the high gas price. And
the Dutch are known to be a nation of traders, or the handelsnatie. So you guys know how to work your way around it.
Exactly. So they are really opportunistic, and they play the game. So they say, okay, we just play the game with them. We don't attack them. We don't defend. So they didn't defend themselves. Yeah. The only thing they said was that, okay, this is unfair, because we now have this disadvantage, but our competitors in the Netherlands don't have this disadvantage. This is the only argument they use, but nothing else. And so now what Clintel is doing, because I really feel that after 18 years writing articles, writing reports, being ignored by the media, being demonized, being called a climate change denier, etc., that we have to start doing other things. Too long, the climate realists, the climate skeptics, they thought, okay, if people really look into this, then everybody will see that there is no crisis and that the policy is crazy. But it's not going to happen. In the EU, we go to net zero. we have to be net zero in 2050, and they do it with solar and wind and biomass, and they don't want to invest
Well,
in
my base part is Monsieur Macron here in France, who in 2018 said we're going to phase out nuclear. So he wanted it to be 40%, and simultaneously saying we're going to be net zero. And then lo and behold, we just lighted the coal power station. I think it was last year. So the inconsistencies here is just absurd.
Yeah, exactly. So I believe now with Clintel, we have to do other things than only writing reports. Of course, we go on explaining the science, etc. But we also have to start doing other things. And this is a very international case because Shell has to take care of the global emissions of the consumers in 2030. And so what we decided to do is we decided to set up, we now try to intervene in this court case because Shell went into appeal. And now we try to intervene because we say Clintel also represents the public interest. But we believe that the public interest is much more than only CO2 reduction, because that's what Friends of the Earth say. They say public interest is 100% only CO2 reduction. That's the most important thing for public interest. We say, whoa, but okay, so next, our economy is gone, our welfare is gone, but we have zero CO2 and then you're happy? That was in the public interest? It's crazy, of course. You know?
Yeah.
So we say, okay, so now we want to intervene because the judge had the wrong information about this whole climate issue, because Friends of the Earth came with all kind of alarmist claims like dangerous climate change. They said it many times, dangerous climate change. And Shell didn't attack that. They didn't defend themselves. And so what we now want to do is that people around the world can now join our case for costless. So you can go to our website. It's a climatecaseofthecentury.org. So because Friends of the Earth is calling this the climate case of the century, but they didn't register this URL. So we decided, okay, let's register and build a website, climatecaseofthecentury.org. So that's our Clintel website. And then people can fill in their name and a signature, and they can join our case. And I think it's really important that a lot of your viewers join our case, because the more people join our case, the more we can say to the judge, look, we have so many thousand people who want to join our case because they support our view on what is in the public interest. And that's a totally different view than the Friends of the Earth view of what is in the public interest.
I want to ask you on Friends of the Earth, because I've noticed this with Greenpeace, I've noticed this with Just Stop Oil. A lot of these organizations get money from oil companies. Just Stop Oil got money from oil dynasties, if you will. Have you ever been able, I mean, since you've been covering climate over the years, been able to explain why the oil companies or their dynasties would be funding environmental movements that go against their interests?
Well, the question is if it goes against their interest. I don't think it goes against their interest. I think it's in their interest. They want to remain friends with the environmental movement. So they want to have a very cozy relationship with them, because I mean, go back to, we had a fair in the 90s in the Netherlands. Shell had an oil platform in the North Sea. It was called the Brent Spar, and the Brent Spar was at the end of his lifetime. And Shell had done a life cycle analysis, etc., and they came up with the solution that the best way was to sink it to the seafloor. But then Greenpeace in the Netherlands said, "Whoa, look at what they're doing. They are sinking their rubbish to the seafloor. This is ridiculous, etc., And they started an international boycott against Shell. This was already in the 90s.
Okay.
And it was very successful because, especially in Germany, people didn't go to the Shell station anymore. And so from that experience, Shell learned that you better not fight with the environmental movement, because you always will lose the battle, the PR battle, because you always have the science against you, because you are big oil, you make a lot of money with this dirty oil, dirty coal, etc. So you will never win the PR battle in the public, in the public arena. So they decided we play along with their games. We support them. We say we have the same agenda, and then we support. In this case, we support wind and solar and biomass. And they know that you can never run a modern society on wind and solar and biomass. So they know that Shell is not investing in nuclear. They are not giving money to nuclear lobbyists, etc. Because that is really a danger for their business model.
Yeah.
But the environmental movement isn't.
Yeah, and it's always worth asking, and maybe I'm conflicted because I worked in nuclear, but I also worked in renewables for what it's worth, and I was employed by an oil company, just by the way. So there we go. But it's always worth asking why the environmental movement opposes the high density nuclear energy that's also low carbon, and yet they go for the solutions that probably doesn't work, or at best it's marginal.
Yeah. You should talk to Michael Schellenberger, of course, about that, and you probably know him. And he is a very interesting figure, in my opinion, about nuclear. Did a lot of research on that. And but by the way, Friends of the Earth in the Netherlands is not paid by oil industry, as far as I know, but they have around 20 million euros a year, so quite a lot of money. But it's an association, so they have a lot of members, so they get a lot of money from their members, membership fees. But they also get about 10 million euros a year from the Dutch government. So the Dutch government is funding this environmental NGO, which then attacks one of our big multinationals, which then says, okay, let's move our headquarters from The Hague to London. And if it goes on like this, they will say, okay, let's close all our plants in the Netherlands and we go elsewhere because we are a global company. And Shell gets a lot of subsidy because part of the project is in the Netherlands, part of the climate policy is CCS, carbon and capture storage, so underground storage of CO2. And Shell is the company who can do that. And they get 2 billion euro subsidy for a big project of CCS.
And those subsidies are green subsidies, right?
Green, it's climate policy. So they are paid. They are paid again.
This is like corruption in broad daylight.
They are So the public interest, So the public ultimately has to pay this 2 billion euros, and it goes straight to Shell. Yeah, and Shell and Friends of the Earth are very cozy in their.
But I want to understand.
They call this kind of lawsuit. They call a sweetheart lawsuit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And people think big environment against big oil. That's water against fire. But it's nothing like that. It's very
theater.
cozy.
It's theater at best, because as you explained, the inconsistency. The Dutch government is giving green subsidies to Shell, and at the same time they're giving money to Friends of the Earth to attack Shell. And the more they attack Shell, probably the more subsidies they will give Shell. So it's very easy to figure out what's going on.
And by doing this, by financing, by all these court verdicts, the government again can say, yes, you see, the judge also thinks that we should be more ambitious with our climate policy. So they can overrule democracy by that, because they can say, yeah, maybe there is not a majority in the parliament, but now we have a verdict by the judge, so we have to do it, guys. There's no other way. It's a very incestuous situation.
It's nuts. I mean, I don't know how to stop it, and I don't think I'm going to ask you how to stop it, because I think it's not simple.
So this is our first step, I think, in a long. People often ask me, and how can you continue doing this after all these years and all this opposition? And then I always say, I'm a tennis player. I'm quite fanatic tennis player, amateur level. But I've been playing tennis all my life. I've also been coaching tennis for a long time. And I say, for me, this is like playing a 5-set match. And I'm already 2 sets down, and I'm 3-0 down in the third set. But I'm not going to give up, of course. This will go on until the fifth set.
Well, you've
And
got a lot of stuff to read and work with, because every day in the media it's another nuts environmental story. I mean, I've just stopped. I can't follow this stuff anymore, and all I know, there's a lot of corruption in this stuff, and it's long past the point where it's about the environment. The environment doesn't matter to these people. It's about
yeah,
money
and
at the end of
also,
the day.
and it's also far behind the point that it's about science.
Oh yeah,
It's not. So we still have the IPCC, but the IPCC is more or less irrelevant. They need these huge reports so they can continue to say, yeah, this is the consensus, and these reports are huge. Of course, they are thousands of pages, but it is irrelevant. I mean, they have a target 1.5 degrees, and even without climate models and without anything, you can say, yeah, well, it's possible that we cross 1.5. It's I cannot say no, this will not happen. Of course it can happen. We are already 1.1. Of course it can become 1.5.
But it's a very arbitrary number to begin with. It starts at the Industrial Revolution. Why that is 00, I've got no idea. But
Yes, exactly, because that was the cold. That was probably 8050 was probably the coldest point of the Holocene of the last 12,000 years.
Yeah.
And that's where we are back at the hockey stick. That's the reason why this hockey stick discussion is still very relevant, because if you acknowledge that the Little Ice Age was the coldest part of the Holocene, it is not a logical reference or starting point for like international climate targets. It's not like it's not even the average temperature in the Holocene. The average temperature in the Holocene for thousands of years was probably higher than it is even today. It's crazy.
The whole thing is nuts. Marcel, I'd like to thank you very much for this conversation. People, please go to Clintel, what's it, .org. They've got very interesting articles, very informative articles about the climate. I've learned a lot from them. And please.
And the World Climate Declaration. They should have a look at the World Climate Declaration, and you can find a link to the Climate Case of the Century website.
Okay. Well, please continue this fight, and I highly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.